Hey, welcome back to Moto Entertainment Channel. Welcome back once again to Stable B. We're back for another discussion topic. Today's topic is going to be the Inline 4 motorcycle and why it's dying. Which you might have seen in the title. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of it, why it's so great, why I love it, and why I'm actually not racing one anymore. I never actually raced one at all. That was kind of, yeah, anyway, we'll get into all of that. But specifically, why the Inline 4 was in existence and now why it is dying off. And this is basically just going to be my opinion on it. I'm going to give you a little bit of factual data on what it is and what other engines are and things like that. But my opinion of why it's going to die off and why we won't see it anymore is what this video is going to be about. So if you have an Inline 4 and you love them, please throw it down in the comments. Let me know what make, model, everything else. While you're down there, subscribe to the channel and throw a like on the video. And let me know if you agree with me on whether or not the Inline 4 is in fact dying off. Let's get into it. As you can see behind me, right there, I'm looking right there. This boy right here, this says Aprilia. Ignore the racing part, but inside this engine right here, down below, is what's called a V4. V like this, meaning there's two cylinders going this way and two going this way, and they do one of those kind of motions. An Inline 4 is just all four of them, and they're going the same way. And they usually be kind of at an angle at the front of your motorcycle, much like I have my Gixxer next to me. So back in the 70s and 80s, we saw the introduction of the Inline 4 in motorcycles, and then late 80s, early 90s is when we start to see those motorcycles gain fairings and really kind of take off into what we know as the sport bike today. Some people call that a super sport, some people just call it a sport bike, crotch rocket, bullet bike, death bullet, death machine, you know, whatever you want to call it. But that's what this channel is all about. That's what I love, that's what I enjoy, and if you're here, probably what you love and enjoy also. So we saw that kind of take off through the 90s. Ducati went a different direction. They had their V-twin. Harley Davidson has always had their V-twins, and they never really went the sport bike direction. But a lot of the Japanese manufacturers specifically went with the Inline 4. And one of the downsides of the Inline 4, which is actually an upside in my opinion, is its torque curve and its power curve. And so I'll put a couple dynos up on the screen, but what we see is not a ramp up in the beginning, but a slow ramp, and then usually some sort of kind of ramp to peak later on in the rev range. So these bikes rev out to, you know, 15, 16, sometimes even 1,000, even higher, 1,000 RPMs, right? So 15, 16,000 RPM is the range you have. And if you're hitting peak torque halfway or later through that, it's gonna be interesting. And I have some experience in my Gixxer 750. Gixxers generally make their peak torque a little bit lower. Their torque curve is a little bit easier to handle. The R6 was once explained to me as being a 250 until 10,000 RPM, and then it's a 600. But I actually haven't ridden an R6, so if you have one in the audience, please throw your comments down below on whether or not that rings true. But what I can say from my experience is that when you're out on the track and you're actually able to open this thing up and give it full throttle, there is definitely like a lag to it almost, right? It almost bogs out at the lower RPM range, and then there is a point where it picks up and it takes off. And what that gives you is kind of an almost uncontrollable. Now, for all the older people in the audience and all the people who have been riding these bikes forever and they race them, they do really well on them, you're gonna tell me I'm crazy. You're gonna be like, it's not uncontrollable at all, and whatever else. And that's not necessarily who I'm speaking to, but I am speaking to you also because to the normal human brain, someone that hasn't ridden motorcycles before, that was where the death machine part came from, is if you let these things go, they go, and they go nuts, but it takes a second to do it, and so you can easily kind of get yourself in some trouble up there. Now, I'm not personally a believer in beginner bikes, and this is what the video is about, but I believe that all bike control comes from your two hands, right? Your clutch and your gas, and if you have good control of those two things, it doesn't matter what bike you're on, you can control it. That's my opinion. But it is a fact that an Inline 4 is a little bit harder engine to control than other configurations. We'll talk about some other configurations in a second. The other thing that I can say is that not only is it harder to control, but when you're out on the racetrack, if you don't have power down in the low revs, when you're coming out of a turn, especially if you want to be competitive, you got to get that bike up into the revs, which means you have to know what gear you're going into before the turn, because you don't want to come out of a turn and then downshift and then give it the gas and then be in the right rev range and go, because you just wasted 3 or 4 seconds doing that, and it's going to upset the suspension of the bike and everything else. So you got to go into the corner in the right gear to come out in the right gear to already be in that higher in the rev range where the power is, where you're good to go, so you can immediately take off. If you don't do that, you find yourself at a spot where you give it the gas, it bogs down a little bit, you're a little behind, and then you finally catch back up and it ramps off on you and you didn't start at that point. And that is where the uncontrollable part comes from, is that it kind of can take off on you. And I've felt that before on different bikes. It's not, you have to be pretty in tune with the bike, but I had just gotten this thing, my Gixxer, which is not the one behind me, it's off to that side. But I just got him back from having a rebuild done, and they did a dyno on it, and I got to actually see that curve. And there was a very large like spike of power at 8,000, right? The curve kind of went from a little bit up to a big ramp like that kind of angle, and then went up from there. And I was out on a track where I came out of a corner at, we'll call it 5,500 RPM. I gave it the gas. It wasn't bogging per se, it still felt fine, but at 8,000 RPM, there was a significant leap in power. And when you add different gearing, different things like that to that bike, you can tell that a little bit more, a little bit less. But it was definitely kind of almost a little bit jolting because I wasn't expecting it at that point, and my mind was now kind of keyed into it. So it kind of threw me for a loop for a second. After I got used to it, everything was fine. And once you get used to a track, you figure out what gear you want to be in, and you kind of get over it a little bit easier. Now, that's the Inline 4, and that is personally my favorite part about it, but also why I think it might be dying. So let's talk about the other engine configurations and why they might be taken over. All right, so back behind me right here, I have my Aprilia. This is a V4. It's also an 1100, so it's not necessarily part of this video because I am attributing this video, the reason I'm putting it out is that I think the Inline 4s are dying, and we've seen it. Now in the super sport leader bike world, where we still have the Gixxer 1000, we still kind of have an R1, but not really anymore. We have BMW S1000 RR, but we've also got a Ducati V4 and the Aprilia V4. And we'll talk about Triumph in a little bit. That's kind of what we're seeing. We'll see what KTM comes out with here in the future and whether or not they're gonna have a street bike for us. I don't know. My KTM owners out there that have the one KTM sport bike that is offered, let me know down in the comments how you like that. Because I'm very curious why KTM hasn't introduced a big time street bike yet for sport riding. Besides, maybe they're a waste of money unless you're gonna race them in World Superbike. Anyway, we're getting off our train. So this V4 makes its peak torque at 3,000 RPM. And I'll let you know that if you give it any gas outside of like idling, it's basically at 3,000 RPM, meaning that the moment that you get on the gas, you've got all of it right then and there. And it goes up and then it flatlines. And it's pretty much just a nice flat torque curve all the way across. There's no ramping up and hitting some sort of peak or making the power go up at a steeper rate, right? So your power, you still make peak power, I wanna say 12,500 RPM. It still revs out to 13. So it's still kind of got that crazy rev range, but that power delivery is smooth the entire time. It's at the same angle the entire time. And your torque is made at the very beginning, which is what causes that angle to just be nice and straight all the way up. So what that gives you is a feeling of more control. Even on a big power bike like this, it feels more controllable because the power delivery is not changing over the entire rev range. And there's caveats to that. There is a little bit here and there, and anyway, everything's different, and you know, there's weather and humidity and temperature, and I got all that. But realistically, your power curve is not changing, or your rate of increase is not changing over the rev range, meaning that no matter where you're giving it gas, no matter if you give it 50% at 5,000 and 50% at 10,000, 50% at 8,000, it's always the same 50% feeling, if that makes sense. And as you're going through it, as you climb from 5 to 6, 7, 8, 10, 13, all the way up, it's a constant ramp up in power until you hit that peak at around 12, right? So what that gives you is that feeling of more control. Now, where we can see this kind of taken over in the real world, because as I mentioned, I still have a BMW S1000, I still have a Gixxer 1000, the R1 is kind of there, kind of not. The Inline 4s and the 1000s are kind of still rampant, but down in your beginner bikes, a 600cc Super Sport used to be a beginner bike, or at least an intermediate between like a very beginner of a 250, which no one wants that as a beginner bike, and usually when people get those, they're on them for like a year and then they're, okay, I'm ready to move on to more power. Generally in the past, people would go, okay, maybe I'm not all in for the sport bike, and they would go a different route. Now we're giving them the option of, hey, we offer the same engine that we offer in our naked bikes, which are more controllable, more street friendly, better in neighborhoods, better around town. We're giving you that option with fairings and a little bit more racy setup, and you can also take it to the track. So not that you can't take a naked bike to the track, and that's not what this video is about, but what I have seen, and once again, this is just my opinion, but we've kind of seen the death of the Inline 4 screaming 600cc, 15,000 or more RPM revving Japanese sport bikes. And we've seen them replaced with easy to control, lighter weight, thinner, more manageable power parallel twins, i.e. very specifically the R6 got replaced with the R7. Now, the R7 for a lot of people was a letdown, for a lot of people it's a great bike. And I've ridden it and I love it and it is super fun. What I will say, and I did a review on it, if you want to see that, check it out. In that review I called it the lazy man's track bike, and a lot of people told me I was crazy on that. And I said, well, in my opinion it's the lazy man's track bike because if you come out of a corner in the wrong gear, I mentioned earlier, if you do that on an Inline 4, you're so low in the rev range that you don't have any power, you don't have anything. On an R7 with that parallel twin, it doesn't really matter because you're going to have that same low-end grunt all the way through, and that power delivery ramps up all the way through no matter where you're starting. So you don't have to worry as much about what gear you're going into a corner in because you can just kind of lug it out. And that also makes it a lot more controllable because throughout the range, it's given to you in a lot more even manner, right? Now, the R7, if I'm comparing the R7 to the R6, and maybe that's a bad comparison and you're going to get mad at me for it, but the truth is it did replace it, and I think the truth is that the world asked for it, and because people would go maybe buy an R3. Someone told them, hey, that's a great beginner bike. They have an R3, they have it for a year, and they get real bored of it because it's just kind of slow, kind of boring. They're out on the road, and they're like, yeah, this isn't really enough for the highway, and it's fine around town, but I want more. I want to have fun. I want to go crazy. And then they see, well, okay, next progression is an R6, but if you're already on an R3 and you want more power, a lot of people will tell you just jump straight to the R1, and they're like, well, I don't know if I'm in for all that sauce yet. So they'd say, okay, hey, here's a great option. It's no fairings, but it's more upright body position, so you're still comfortable, kind of like on the R3. You get more power, but it's not so much that it's absolutely crazy, and you get it in a very controllable manner, which means that around town, especially on lower torque or lower RPM values, you're perfectly fine. Introduce the MT-07 and 09 and 10 and all of those. But then a couple years later, everyone's like, well, hey, why don't we put fairings on this thing? Introduce the R7, right? MT-07 with fairings on it and a little bit racier setup. Really just has some clip-ons. They move the foot pegs back, I think like a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then the other nice part about this parallel twin is, yes, the power went down, but because you have all that torque, you kind of still get that like gut feeling of being pushed back in the seat and the bike taking off because it's got all that upfront torque in your face ready to go. So when you kick it, it kind of goes. Whereas with an R6, it might take you a second if you aren't already up in that rev range. You got to let that thing build up, wind up. Once it gets wound, it goes, right? It takes off, but it takes a second. So the R7 almost has that advantage over it where like you get that instant gratification of twisting the throttle and being pushed back in the seat and the bike taking off. The other advantage we see is that the parallel twin is, well, half as wide as a parallel quad, i.e. an Inline 4, right? Because it's 2 less cylinders. It's about half as wide. So we can bring the whole bike down and make it thinner, which means it's lighter, which means it's also easier to control, a lot easier to handle on the racetrack or on the road, in parking lots, in a driveway, at the top of a hill where you're maybe a shorter person can only get 1 foot on the ground. This bike's got 50, 60 less pounds on it, and it's thinner. It feels like less of a bike underneath you, therefore it's more controllable. So that is all kind of what led to it. Now we as humans, Yamaha said, hey, here's your R7, and we said, this is freaking awesome, and we went after it. Now if you're a diehard race guy, you probably looked at the R7 and said that thing looks boring, and you stuck with the R6, and you're out there trying to piece together a race R6, and you'll keep doing that for the next 5 to 10 years. But the truth is that the average consumer, average motorcycle consumer, just saw a perfect beginner and finished bike hit the market that is also still track worthy and does have a place to race in most clubs across America. So is it the wrong thing? That's the question. So anyway, back behind me right here, I have my trusty Gixxer 750. I kind of talked about how the RPM on it does definitely, it's got a kick up point, and I also talked about the fact that the Gixxer specifically is a little bit smoother generally than the R6 that I don't have personal experience with. So I'm not going to lie to you and say that I've ridden them all and can give you that answer, but that's just what I've heard. And if you look at the dyno sheets across all the makes and models, that's kind of what you'll see. So there's factual data out there to prove that. But the important part is that both of them are still kind of that ramp up style, and eventually you hit a point where your power curve goes from a shallower angle to a steeper angle. It doesn't go straight up. That'd be wild. Jumping straight from 75 RPM to, or 75 horsepower to like 95 would be absolutely insane. It doesn't do that, but it can almost feel like it depending on how you hit it and where you hit it and if you're ready for it and everything else. So moral of the story is that the Inline 4 motorcycle had its time, and it was beautiful, and I'm a huge fan of it. I wish it wasn't dying off. I am kind of a little mad at the way the world is going with what we want in a motorcycle. That being said, I understand it, right? People do a lot of their riding around town. If you're trying to stay within the legal ramifications of riding a motorcycle, you have to stay within the speed limit. So having something that doesn't really get any fun until it's speeding anywhere in the country isn't really that useful. And having something that, like I said, gives you that instant gratification, that instant feedback when you twist the throttle because it's got all that torque down low, is a lot more fun. And that's why we're seeing that R7, we're seeing the Aprilia RS660. We're seeing people buy a lot more of these V4s and like them a lot. We're seeing Yamaha just completely kill off everything. So they've got their R7, they've also got their R9, which instead of being a big inline 4 is an inline 3, has similar characteristics. Insert Triumph. Yeah, Triumph has their 660, they had their 675 for a long time. One of the cool parts about the 675 was that it had a little bit more of that kind of shallower power delivery because of the inline 3. It had more torque down low. It was kind of like a good mix of both worlds. I do also think this is what we're going to see with the R9. Obviously we have the MT-09 to kind of give us that, what is this going to look like already. But yeah, the inline 4 is dead. That's about all there is to it. The people of the world said, hey, I don't really know what to do with this. It's too much. Or they said, I love this. I'm going up. I'm going straight to the 1000. So like I said, we'll probably continue to see the S1000. We'll continue to see the Gixxer 1000. We'll continue to see the Fireblade. That's the Honda. The Kawasaki ZX-10. Those are a couple I didn't mention before. We'll continue to see those for a little bit. And I don't really think they're going to go anywhere. I don't think, personally, that the manufacturers are going to stop building them. We are seeing some changing in the racing world. This is just kind of for my more racy people that follow, right? MotoGP in a couple years here is going to jump down to an 850cc engine configuration on their bikes. How that's going to affect the market, I don't know. We'll see what happens to World Superbike and if they follow similar rules. That'll kind of decide how it's going to affect everything. But the world is shying away from these top speed, huge horsepower, leader bike killers or whatever you want to call them, and moving into something a lot more reasonable. What we're getting before all that really happens is on the lower end of the market, which the lower end of the market that has always kind of been like that, but we're really seeing these inline 4s, these 600cc screamers just being deleted completely, and they're leaving for good. And they're being replaced with the parallel twins or the inline 3s. Usually not a V-twin because that's a little different. I think Ducati's still doing that with their V2, but they're kind of the only ones, and the V2 is not like a super small CC bike. So the parallel twins are really kind of taken over. And in my opinion, it's because of that nice controllable feeling and that instant feedback. Because most people, when they hop on a motorcycle, if you hop on an R7 and it's your first bike, you're still going to feel like it's fun. Now, if you go get on a ZX6 later on, you're going to realize kind of what you're missing, and you're going to realize that you didn't have that power. But if you've only ever ridden an R7, it's going to feel super fun and super torquey. And even I get on one, and even out of the track, like, it's fun to come out of a corner and just rip it. You know, front wheel pops off a little bit, and you're doing all the fun things, and it kind of just gives you that in a very controllable, nice, easy manner. You don't have to work for it. And maybe that's the truth of it. Maybe we've all just gotten really lazy with our motorcycle riding and with what we want out of a bike. But I will say the one nice thing that we are seeing is that because the world is kind of going that direction, we are also seeing the electronics from the big bikes trickle down into the smaller bikes. Whether or not you like electronics, that's up to you. I'm kind of a fan of them, kind of not. It depends on what they are and why you use them. If you rely solely on electronics, I think they are a hindrance, and I think they are making it easier to ride, but can also ruin you as a rider and make it so that you're not as good, or you don't have the opportunity to become as good. But if you use them the right way and you don't rely on them, they can definitely help. They can help out quite a bit. So I am kind of glad that we're seeing the electronics filter down and come through. Also, clutchless shifting is just so nice, especially downshifting. That is one that I will admit to all day long. I love a clutchless downshift. It makes life so much easier. There's that lazy aspect for you. But moral of the story, in my opinion, the inline 4 motorcycle is dead. It's out. It's out for the count. We got a couple guys hanging on to it, specifically down in the 600cc range. That's what I'm talking about. The leader bikes, we'll see what happens in a couple of years. But I think the 600cc inline 4 is just down and out. It's dead. Everyone's done with it. We're moving on to smaller and better things. I can't say bigger and better because they aren't bigger. And I don't know if I can even say better. It's sad. I'm not a huge fan of it. But you know what? If you love your R7 or you love your RS660, I've ridden both those bikes. They are a ton of fun. I get why you love them. Stick to them. Best thing you can do, honestly, is go to a track day and then maybe start club racing. That's how you can help out the sport and continue to grow it. We do have to sell motorcycles to do that. So keep buying your little parallel twins, enjoy them, bring them to the racetrack, see what they're like, and maybe ride an inline 4 at some point in your life. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them down in the comments section. Throw a like on the video while you're down there. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you need anything else, if you have any other questions you don't want to throw in the comments, you can always hit me up on Instagram at JKMoto Entertainment or on Facebook. Send me a DM. I'd be happy to answer any and all questions over there. Thanks for being here. We'll see you guys in the next video.